Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, Ukraine War Frontline update for the 27th of April 2023. Before we get to the frontline, let's dip into the ISW, Institute for the Study of War, American think tank. In some of their preamble, I think there's some really interesting observations here. Competition among Russian private military companies is likely increasing in Bakhmut. That's drawing on the videos I discussed with you in my extra video yesterday. Go and check that out. There is this internal conflict between all manner of operators in the Russian military sphere. Okay, Russia appears to be, and this is part of what Russia do. This is, whereas the UK, Britain was a maritime empire. You used to go around the world sticking flags in different countries and saying, "Oh, you're ours now because we've got there's a flag here that's got our sort of emblem on it. You don't have a flag, so we own you now." That kind of thing. So we'd sail around the world and doing that. Russia has traditionally been more of a land-based empire where they go to neighboring countries or regions and sort of take over and start like integrating their own population with that population. And so therefore it was really difficult for those people to rise up and say, we want our independence back, because actually it's a mix of Russian and indigenous people and so on and so forth. Or they deport people from there and import their people. And they did this 2014 onwards. It's what's happening in Crimea and Donbass, and why it's very difficult going forwards to liberate Crimea and Donbass and have people there go, yeah, thank you, we want you to control this land, because actually the people there are broadly Russians who have been imported in, and the pro-Ukrainian people who used to live there have obviously run away and escaped because they don't want to be under Russian rulership. And what would have to happen if you liberated Crimea and Donbass, you'd have to move those people back in. You'd have to re-import indigenous Ukrainians and then work out what to do with the Russians who are there. Anyway, the ISW here says Russia appears to be continuing a deliberate depopulation campaign in occupied areas of Ukraine in order to facilitate the repopulation of Ukrainian territories with Russians. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Malyar stated on the 26th that Russia is trying to change the ethnic composition of Ukraine by actively conducting a large-scale resettlement of people mainly from poorer and remote regions of Russia into Ukraine. Malyar noted that the most intensive efforts are ongoing in occupied Luhansk, and remarked that Russia is also deporting Ukrainians and forcibly resettling them in Russia. So you're kind of taking Ukrainians, brainwashing them into being, especially young Ukrainians, brainwashing them into being Russian, and then taking Russians and putting them in Ukraine. And so the makeup of Ukraine is therefore pro-Russian. And then they can say, well, look, everyone who lives here wants to be in Russia. Let's have a referendum. Oh, it turns out you all want to stay under the rulership of Russia. Yeah, because they're all Russians and you brought them in from Russia. So it's something that needs to be carefully looked at, understood, and there needs to be really clever ways of solving that issue. Anyway, now to the front line, northeast Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna. Here's the axis we always start with. There have been some, so we go to my map, it doesn't look anything like that there because I'm in the wrong place. Of course, I'm in Avdivka. So let's go to the north and we'll pop along to the Kupiansk area. There have been, oh dear, it's going absolutely insane. Yeah, so there have been repelled reconnaissance and sabotage groups operating, apparently according to the Russians, in Sinkivka. So these are Ukrainian groups, and Mazyutivka, so on and so forth. So we go to ISW. It talks about MOD claimed that Russian forces suppressed 4 Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups in Mazyutivka and Krokmalna, which is 21 kilometers northwest of Svatova. Russian Western Grouping of Forces spokesperson Yakimkin claimed that Russian forces destroyed 2 Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups near Novoselivka and Sinkivka. So the sorts of places we're talking about are up here near Kupiansk, and then down to Kuzmivka to Novoselivka, and a reconnaissance group there. Syriac Maps said that they've realigned their map here to suggest that Novoselivsk is definitely under the control of the Ukrainians. That's been the case for ages and ages. So they did that yesterday. I didn't really mention that too much because actually it just falls in line with what I've already got. Anyway, for the rest of the line, Ukrainian sources reported that Russians did not conduct any offensive operations along that line. So Kupiansk-Kreminna, Ukrainian Colonel Cherevati has reported that Russian forces have not conducted offensive operations along this sector of the front line for some time, but the Russian forces are continuing to conduct heavy indirect fire in this sector of the front. So they're using indirect fire like artillery, mortars, and whatnot along this front line. But you start seeing reports of activity when you start getting to Makivka, Nevska, Terny, Torska, that kind of area. Which are along this area there. The ISW says that Russian mill bloggers claim unsuccessful attacks at Makivka, Torska, Bilohorivka. Another Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces pushed back Ukrainian forces from positions on the eastern outskirts of Spirna, although the ISW assessed that Russian forces likely occupied those positions earlier than the date claimed. And that is to say that there is activity in Bilohorivka and Spirna, which is here, Bilohorivka, which is there. So, sorry, Google Maps is not behaving well. I can't move the mouse. I'm going to have to get an external mouse. So as we come down to Bakhmut, there have been some really significant mapping changes here. Remember, my map has the blue. I've kept the blue lines where they were from previously. So that is to say that the Ukrainian lines in blue have not changed, even though they have. It's just to indicate what has changed over the last 24 hours. The red line is pro-Russian mapper, Syriac maps, and the yellow is pro-Ukrainian mapper, deep state map. And the Russian and Ukrainian mappers have broadly started aligning now. A huge amount of territory was taken by the Russians, or at least there was some mapping realignment by deep state map that might indicate that a huge amount of territory was taken, or that indeed they were just catching up with their mapping. Nonetheless, from Syriac maps as well, significant territory has been gained by the Russians over the last 24 hours or so. So as you can see, this large area at the in the north of Bakhmut here, I think this is a sort of garage area there, or I might be incorrect. There's certain garage areas. Well, let's go and have a look. Okay. Other mappers. So this is War Mapper saying the Russians have advanced further west through the city, and there's indications that they've taken further territory here in the west. I don't know if they've really come as far as the other mappers have. So the other mappers are right down here now. I mean, Ukraine really are being pushed right out of Bakhmut. Indeed, Poulet-Volant here indicates that entirely along the west and northern fronts, the Ukrainians have been pushed back in the city. I mean, really, they've got very small amounts of Bakhmut left to defend. And of course, they'll have a higher force density there, which means that you've got the risk of being taken out in larger numbers because there are more of you in a smaller area. Situational report from Roman Hrushenko, the commander of the 127th Territorial Defense Brigade, says the enemy is shelling our positions with artillery and aviation around the clock. Heavy flamethrower systems are widely used. Despite this, the defenders of the city are holding on. I want to thank the citizens of Ukraine and the whole world for the support of our heroes. This is an invaluable contribution to raising the morale of the soldiers defending Bakhmut. Not too much detail as to exactly what's going on there. No reports, and says to the front, fighting continues in Bakhmut in the northwestern area. Russian soldiers claim further advances in the children's hospital, but this has not yet been confirmed. The areas dotted in black are believed to be under Russian control. They are squeezing and squeezing. So that's broadly in line with what the other mappers are saying as well. So Syriac maps here says situation in Bakhmut city. Russian army broke Ukrainian defensive line of the big garage complex on the west and forced the Ukrainian army to withdraw from most of the area. In addition, troops took full control over Vodokanal district and reached the intersection of Tchaikovskoho and Yubileyny streets, thus cutting one of the most important supply routes of Ukrainian forces. Moreover, the front line were moved to the entire Polevya Street and Alexandra Matrosova Street. Okay, so essentially what that translates to is all of this territory being taken here, and an interdiction possibly of the main road here. So if we come and look there, that's what Syriac Maps was talking about with regard to those different road names, particularly around there. The garage area is, as I say, around here. So you can see that's a lot of territory that has been taken. A little bit of disagreement with the mappers there, but broadly now they are in line with each other over most of central Bakhmut, although it's not even central Bakhmut anymore, it's western Bakhmut. So we go to pro-Russian source Rebar. They say to the north of the Kromova village, Russian troops continue to storm Ukrainian positions. As a result of fierce fighting, servicemen managed to break the first enemy defense line and occupy part of the trenches. Well, that's what they claimed like 2 days ago. So I think there's a lot of toing and froing in this area. So it's talking about here, just north of the 00506 highway. But of course, as the front line here gets closer and closer to the edge of Bakhmut, there's no point having a supply route. You've got nothing left to supply. So I think if we don't see a counterattack imminently, then it looks like the plan was always to just effectively operationally withdraw from Bakhmut, but doing it in a way that costs Russia as many lives as possible. And there's still claims that Russia are losing huge amounts of troops in doing this. Russians are claiming that Ukrainians are losing huge amounts of troops, etc., etc. In Bakhmut, says Rebar, Russian assault groups continue to advance, pushing the Ukrainians to the western outskirts of the city. According to the objective assessment, of course, Wagner PMC assault groups currently control at least 85% of the city's territory. Actually, that would be correct, to be honest. Possibly more than that, actually. Fierce fighting continues north of Avdivka. Okay, so we'll get to that in a second. So that is what's going on in Bakhmut. And to be fair, the ISW doesn't really say anything that's worth noting that's particularly different from this kind of outcome, that the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians back. The Ukrainians are still holding on, and it's broadly the same as it's been for the last few weeks. Just the map changes, but it's the same kind of tactics, same kind of understanding of what's going on, and the idea that the intention is to fix the Russian troops and to trip them as much as possible and to gain time. So this is all about these guys not being able to be used elsewhere. So if Bakhmut fell, then they could push all these troops to Avdivka and make a difference in Avdivka or somewhere else, or they could then push on to Chasiv Yar. So this just keeps the battle here where there is at least some semblance of control that Ukraine can have. They can booby trap buildings, they can withdraw at a rate that suits them. So I think that's what's happening here, and we're just seeing a continuation of that until indeed they'll be out of Bakhmut and pull back, I presume, to Chasiv Yar. I don't know whether they'd try and hold these places like Ivanivska and some of these villages around Vuhledar, so on and so forth. I guess we'll see. But that is what's happening in Bakhmut. Let's now move on to Avdivka. So when it comes to Avdivka, we come further down south here, past Toretsk, New York, Shumy. There are some claims about activity north of Avdivka in this area between Krasnohorivka and Bakhmutivka, so that's that area there. Some gains here by the railway line. So we go to Syriac Maps, they say just by this railway line here. The Russian forces and DPR continue advancing towards Novokalinove and took control over a new section of the railway north of Krasnohorivka. And that's and then it goes on to talk about Bakhmut. So that is basically all that Syriac Maps reports of this area. ISW says that geolocated footage posted on April 26 shows that Russian forces have made limited gains west of the N20 Donetsk city to Kramatorsk-Slovyansk highway, about 10 kilometers north of Avdivka, which is exactly where we're talking about here. So that's that highway that goes up to connect those other places. A Russian mill blogger claimed on April 26 that Russian forces successfully advanced west of Novobakhmutivka and pushed Ukrainian forces away from the highway, which appears consistent with available footage confirming these positions. And then the geolocated footage it talks about here, and I'm going to check this out because I love a bit of that. says, and this is referring to some dropping of IEDs on Russian forces. You can see the railway line there. A work of servicemen from 110 OMBR and 35 OBR MP in the Avdivka direction. Thanks to their work, the occupying units of the Russian army are demoralized and afraid to go into battle. The documents of Russians were also seized. So there must have been some troop activity around there. So the Russians were, as according to this geolocator, in this location. So if we copy that and whack that into our little Google do we what's it, there we see that that activity is taking place exactly where we've seen a little bit of gain in territory of the Russians. Actually, Syriac map, if we look there, that was actually where the Russians were already there yesterday. I think I updated this area here yesterday, and then today the claim is this further area here, which isn't necessarily supported by that footage, that geolocated footage. However, the Russians are there or thereabouts. Ukrainians, though, in order to take the papers, you would assume that if that tweet is to be believed, would have to be on foot and operating in those trenches as well. So yeah, there are some gains to the north of Avdivka, but otherwise it seems fairly stable around there. Indeed, it's just the usual kind of repelled attacks around Severny, Pervomaisky, and then it goes on to talk about Marinka. Indeed, that's all it says really about Marinka. There isn't too much to report, although that's not to say there isn't really fierce fighting taking place in Marinka. It is a hellscape, as we know. There's still lots of footage coming out of Marinka. In fact, I saw some ATGM footage, Russians using ATGMs around Marinka from outside of Marinka, I think, firing into Marinka. So some Cornet or Conkers, I'm not sure. Anyway, that's some footage that I might show you in an extra. I think I have got it down to show you in an extra. Anyway, we come down to Vuhledar. So what do we have that's happened there? Well, the ISW says Russian forces claim that sources claim that Russian forces continued offensive operations in Western Donetsk yesterday. A Russian mill blogger claimed that elements of the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, so these are the crack Marines that aren't so crack anymore because they have been cracked. They've been reconstituted somewhere between 3 and 9 times. So their force quality is much worse than it was, but they've been involved in small arms engagements on the outskirts of Vuhledar. Russian mill bloggers reported that Russian forces have increased their use of FAB 500 air-dropped bombs to target Ukrainian strongholds in the urban areas of Bakhmut, and also footage posted of airstrikes in Vuhledar. And I showed you some footage of some of the buildings in Vuhledar the other day that appear to have been hit by FAB 500s because they're much more destroyed than we've seen from months and months of artillery usage. So therefore, we can safely say that the Russians are using FAB 500 guided bombs to hammer Vuhledar as well as indeed Bakhmut. Now, Syriac Maps claims that the Russians are much closer and back in this kind of Dacha area to the east of Vuhledar. Deep State Maps does not claim that, hasn't really changed their mapping around here for a good few weeks, I guess. But if they are in this area, then that is, I think, what the ISW is sort of hinting at, that there are small arms activity to the on the outskirts of Vuhledar. So one would assume that would be in this kind of area there. So maybe the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, the Marines, are operating in that area. Right, let's go on to Zaporizhia and Kherson. So as we move along to the west. Sorry, I'm using an external mouse now, and I never know which way the roller goes. As we move to the west, we come to the Zaporizhia front line. Not a lot to report of the Zaporizhia front line. There's quite a lot in the ISW about Kherson because the Russian military blogger community is still arguing about this quite a lot, about whether there really is Ukrainian presence on the east bank of the Dnipro River. So lots of conversation about that. I won't go into the details because it's all pretty much the same as yesterday. Milga blogger has previously, this is someone saying that they weren't arguing that the claims of the Ukrainians being on East Bank are false, but then ISW saying, yeah, but this mill blogger has reported previously demonstrably false information. So basically, take their claims with a pinch of salt. ISW expanded Russian claims northward closer to the Dacha area south of Avdivka on the east bank of the Dnipro, based on claims from a prominent mill blogger, but has not observed visual evidence of Ukrainian forces operating south of the Antonivsky Bridge since April the 22nd. So whether there is activity to the south of this river on the east bank or left bank of the river here, whether there is presently it's a bit hard to say. What we can say is we haven't seen evidence that they are operating around here since the 22nd, and this entailed this area very close to Kherson city itself. And then the ISW goes on to say a few bits which are worthy of note. Ukrainian forces are already quietly conducting counteroffensive activities in Kherson Oblast by targeting Russian ammunition depots as well as equipment and manpower concentration areas. There was talk about them being really effective in their counter-battery activities, the Ukrainians around Kherson. Is this a sign of a potential counter-offensive maneuver across the Dnipro? I don't know. It's a pretty difficult place. There's a pretty obvious natural barrier there, but I guess it gives them an option. But also, the artillery along the river has really been hammering Kherson to the point where there are now less people living in Kherson than there was when it was liberated by the Ukrainians. So people have moved out because they're getting such a hard time by artillery. Russian officials are continuing efforts to secure rear ground lines of communications, GLOCs, in occupied Crimea. The Russian builders have finished the most difficult stages of the restoration of the railway section of the Kerch Strait Bridge, and the railway traffic across the bridge will resume ahead of schedule on an unspecified date in May. A Russian Transport Ministry representative stated that 26th of April, Russian officials plan for more than 80 inspection points to operate at entrances to the Kerch Strait Bridge by April 28th. Russian officials are likely increasing efforts to secure and improve the GLOC across the Kerch Strait into Crimea in preparation for potential Ukrainian counteroffensives. You can bet that the Ukrainians will try and blow up that bridge again. There'll be Hrim-2s, there'll be possibly naval drones, whatever. They'll just be. I would have thought they'll be trying to hammer it. Satellite imagery indicates that Russian forces have transferred armored vehicles and artillery systems from occupied Crimea to an unspecified area on April the 25th. Geolocated satellite imagery shows a military depot near Terheniev, which is northeast of Jankoy. So Jankoy is that hub that is in. Let's see if my mouse is now working. Yep. Jankoy is there. So northeast of there is going to be somewhere around there. Imagery shows a military depot there with armoured fighting vehicles, tanks and artillery systems on February the 11th, notably empty on the 25th. So Russian forces may have transferred the military equipment to support ongoing Russian offensive operations in Donetsk or other sectors of the front line, or to prepare for potential counteroffensives. So there you go. Not an insane amount that has been happening on the front lines. That's reflected in the losses that I talked to you about in my news video this morning, that the losses are lower for yesterday across the front line. There are the obvious, flashpoints of Avdivka, of Bakhmut, of perhaps Marinka and Vuhledar, but other than that, things are relatively quiet. Anyway, thank you. Please like, subscribe, and share. Please, if you disagree with things I say, do that in a robust but sensible manner. It turns out that if you say anything about moderation, people go absolutely mental. Did a couple of videos on moderation, or just a segment and then a reply video. People absolutely hate any form of moderation, as if they don't moderate their own lives, and those are their family members and people around them. And we do it all the time. Anyway, I won't get into the long words of that again. Take care. Speak soon.